The January blizzard had buried the Montana Valley under 4 feet of snow in 3 days, and while smoke from neighboring cabins sputtered and died as families struggled with frozen wood piles, 2 chimneys on the Hoffman homestead poured steady columns of heat into the white sky. What Ingrid Hoffman had built the previous summer, those strange wooden structures that made travelers stop and stare, had just proven the difference between warmth and hypothermia. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of frontier innovation move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's tale is even more remarkable than this one. The fire in the Hoffman cabin went out on February 9, 1862, at approximately 3 in the morning. Ingrid woke to the sound her husband made, a wet, rattling cough that had grown worse over the previous week. The cabin was cold, far colder than it should have been at this hour. She reached for Lars in the darkness, felt his forehead, and knew immediately that his fever had worsened. He needed warmth. He needed it now. She rose from their bed and moved to the fireplace, her breath visible in the moonlight that filtered through the oiled paper window. The coals should have still held heat from the previous evening's fire, but when she knelt and touched the stones, they were cold, completely cold. That meant the fire had died hours ago, and she had slept through it while her husband's condition deteriorated in the freezing cabin. Ingrid dressed quickly, pulling on the wool dress she kept near the bed and wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. She needed firewood, and she needed it immediately. Their supply near the fireplace had run out, which meant going outside to the woodpile. She glanced at Lars, who had fallen back into fitful sleep, his breathing labored and irregular. The door resisted when she tried to open it. Snow had drifted against it during the night. She pushed harder, forcing it open. Enough to squeeze through into the pre-dawn darkness of a Montana winter. The cold struck her like a physical blow. The temperature had dropped well below zero, and the wind cut through her shawl as if it were paper. Their woodpile was 20 yards from the cabin door, a standard distance that had seemed reasonable when Lars had stacked it the previous fall. Ingrid waded through knee-deep snow, her dress quickly soaking through as she fought toward the pile. When she reached it, she found exactly what she had feared. The canvas they had used to cover the wood had blown free during the night's wind. Snow had buried the top half of the pile, and ice coated the exposed logs. She grabbed the nearest piece of wood and pulled. It was frozen to the log beneath it. She tried another, then another. Every piece she touched was either locked in ice or soaked through from melted snow that had refrozen. She dug deeper into the pile, throwing aside frozen logs, searching for dry wood buried in the center. Her hands were numb now, her fingers barely able to grip. Finally, she found 3 pieces that might burn, though even these were damp. She gathered them against her chest and turned back toward the cabin, her teeth chattering so violently she bit her tongue. The journey back through the snow seemed twice as long as the journey out. By the time she reached the door, she could barely feel her feet. Inside, she knelt at the fireplace and tried to start a fire with the damp wood. The kindling caught, smoldered, filled the cabin with smoke, and died. She tried again, the same result. The wood was too wet, it would not burn. Ingrid tried for 40 minutes to coax flame from the wet wood before accepting defeat. The cabin filled with acrid smoke that made Lars cough harder, his body convulsing with each spasm. She opened the door to clear the air, which only made the cabin colder. The kindling pile had dwindled to nothing. The wet logs sat in the fireplace, mocking her efforts with their refusal to ignite. She knew what she had to do. Their nearest neighbors, the Carlson family, lived 2 miles east. They would have fire, dry wood, help. She wrapped herself in every piece of warm clothing she owned, checked Lars one final time, and stepped back into the brutal cold. The walk to the Carlson homestead took nearly an hour through snow that reached her thighs in places. When she finally saw their cabin, relief flooded through her until she noticed something wrong. No smoke rose from their chimney. Martha Carlson answered Ingrid's knock, looking exhausted and frightened. Her 3 children huddled under blankets near a fireplace that held only cold ashes. Their woodpile, Martha explained, had the same problem as the Hoffmans. 2 days of freezing rain followed by heavy snow had turned every log into an ice-encased block. They had burned their last dry kindling the previous evening. Now they had nothing that would catch fire. The two women stood in silence, understanding the gravity of their situation. Without fire, without heat, in temperatures this extreme, survival became a matter of hours, not days. Martha's youngest child, a boy of 4, had already stopped shivering, which Ingrid recognized as a dangerous sign. His body was shutting down, conserving what little warmth remained. Ingrid left the Carlsons and continued east to the Muller cabin, then the Patterson homestead. The story repeated at each location: wet wood, dead fires, families wrapped in every blanket they owned, burning furniture when they had it, watching their children grow colder. The entire valley was suffering the same crisis, and no one had a solution. She returned home as the sun climbed higher, though it provided no warmth through the heavy clouds. Lars was worse. His fever had climbed higher, and he drifted between consciousness and delirium. Ingrid sat beside him, holding his hand, feeling helpless in a way she had never experienced. She was a capable woman, strong and resourceful. She had survived the journey west, built a life in harsh country, endured hardships that had broken others, but she could not make wet wood burn. Lars died on February 11, 1862, 53 hours after their fire went out. The cold had weakened him, and his lungs had filled with fluid his body could not fight without warmth. Ingrid sat with his body through the night, the cabin barely warmer than the air outside, understanding with terrible clarity that her husband had not died from illness. He had died from wet firewood. Ingrid buried Lars on February 14th when the ground thawed enough to dig. Neighbors helped, the same neighbors who had lost their own fires, who understood that Lars Hoffman's death could easily have been their own. They spoke words meant to comfort, but Ingrid barely heard them. Her mind had already moved beyond grief into something harder and more focused. She spent the week following the funeral studying her failure. The woodpile that had killed her husband sat exactly where Lars had built it, 20 yards from the cabin door. She examined every aspect of its construction, or rather, its lack of construction. It was simply stacked wood, arranged in a rough rectangular pile, covered with canvas tied down with rocks and rope. This was how everyone stored firewood. This was standard practice, accepted wisdom, the way things had always been done. The canvas had failed first. Wind had worked at it constantly, finding gaps, creating lift, eventually tearing it free. Even when secured, canvas was temporary protection, degrading in sun and weather, requiring constant replacement and adjustment, and canvas only protected the top of the pile. Wind-driven rain and snow still reached the sides. Moisture penetrated the pile from multiple directions, wicking through wood grain, freezing in place when temperatures dropped. Ingrid walked to each neighbor's homestead over the following days, asking to see their wood storage. The Carlsons had their pile behind their cabin, covered with bark and branches. The Muellers used canvas like the Hoffmans had. The Pattersons had built a simple lean-to, 3 walls and a roof, which was better than open stacking but still allowed weather to reach the wood from the open side. Every method she examined shared the same fundamental weakness. They treated firewood storage as an afterthought, something requiring minimal effort and investment. She began asking questions. How much wood did a family burn in a winter? How long did wood need to dry before it burned efficiently? What happened to wood stored in different conditions? The answers painted a clear picture. A family needed approximately 4 to 6 cords of wood to survive a Montana winter. Wood-cut green needed at least 6 months to dry properly, preferably a full year. Wood stored in wet conditions could reabsorb moisture even if initially dry, rendering it useless when needed most. Ingrid calculated the mathematics of survival. 6 cords of wood represented roughly 768 cubic feet of split logs. That volume, if protected properly, meant the difference between life and death. Yet families treated this critical resource with less care than they gave their livestock shelters or food storage. Barns were built with solid roofs and walls. Root cellars were dug and reinforced. But firewood, the single resource that kept humans alive through winter, was stacked outside and covered with cloth. Spring came late to Montana in 1862, arriving in mid-April with muddy reluctance. Ingrid spent those weeks planning with an intensity that worried her neighbors. They expected grief, expected her to mourn, and perhaps leave the valley, return to family back east. Instead, she bought lumber, large quantities of lumber. She purchased it from the mill in Helena, paying for delivery, spending money that a widow should have conserved. The neighbors whispered. They wondered. They thought grief had affected her judgment. Ingrid began construction on May 1st. She selected a site 15 feet south of her cabin, cleared and leveled the ground, and started building what appeared to be another cabin. The structure's footprint measured 12 feet wide by 20 feet long. Neighbors who stopped to observe saw her digging post holes, setting vertical posts, building a frame that made no sense. Why would a widow build a second cabin? Where was the door going to be? Why was the entire front side left completely open? She worked alone, refusing offers of help, maintaining a polite but firm distance from those who came to question her plans. The framework went up over 2 weeks, heavy posts set 3 feet into the ground, horizontal beams connecting them, cross-bracing to prevent racking and wind. The construction was solid, overbuilt by normal standards, engineered to support weight far beyond what seemed necessary. The roof construction began in late May. Ingrid built it with a steep pitch, reasoning that snow would shed rather than accumulate. She used proper rafters, not rough poles, spacing them 16 inches apart. Over the rafters, she laid planking, and over the planking, she applied layer after layer of tar paper, creating a waterproof barrier that would last years rather than months. The final layer was split cedar shakes, overlapped and fitted with care that would have impressed a professional carpenter. By early June, the structure stood complete. It had 3 walls, a solid roof, and an entirely open front facing south toward maximum sun exposure. The interior was empty space, 12 feet wide, 20 feet long, 8 feet tall at the peak. Neighbors who saw the finished building were baffled. Some thought it was an oversized equipment shed. Others speculated it was a workshop, though why a widow needed a workshop remained unclear. A few suggested it was a stable, though the open front made poor sense for housing animals. Ingrid said nothing about the building's purpose. She simply began the next phase, which was cutting firewood with systematic determination that bordered on obsession. She worked from dawn until dark, felling trees, cutting them into 16-inch lengths, splitting the rounds into pieces that would fit her fireplace. She worked through summer heat that made others seek shade. She worked until her hands blistered, healed, and calloused into leather. By mid-July, Ingrid had cut and split enough wood to fill her mysterious structure. Neighbors watched as she began stacking, and finally the building's purpose became clear. She was creating a firewood storage shed, though calling it a shed seemed inadequate for something built with such permanence and care. The structure was engineered to hold firewood, the way a barn was engineered to store hay, with the same attention to protection and accessibility. She stacked the wood in rows that ran the full depth of the building, creating columns of split logs arranged bark side up for water shedding. The stacking pattern allowed air to circulate between pieces, promoting continued drying, while the roof overhead prevented any moisture from reaching the wood. Each piece was positioned deliberately, creating a stable mass that would not shift or collapse. The work was tedious, requiring constant attention to detail, but Ingrid approached it with the same methodical focus she had applied to every aspect of the project. As the first structure filled, she began building a second one. This shed went up north of her cabin, mirroring the position of the first. Same dimensions, same construction techniques, same overbuilt solidity. Neighbors who had been curious became vocal in their criticism. Martha Carlson visited one afternoon, ostensibly to bring preserves, actually to express concern. Why was Ingrid building 2 enormous sheds for firewood? Why spend money and effort on structures that were vastly more than necessary? A simple covered pile would suffice. This was excessive, wasteful, the behavior of someone not thinking clearly. Ingrid listened politely and continued working. She understood how her project appeared to others. She was a widow, alone, investing significant resources into firewood storage that seemed absurdly over-engineered. What she was building looked permanent enough to last 50 years. What rational person built 50-year structures for storing wood? But Ingrid's rationality operated from different premises than her neighbors. They thought about convenience and cost. She thought about February 9th, about wet wood and cold ashes, about her husband's last labored breaths. The second shed filled by late August. Ingrid had now cut, split, and stored approximately 12 cords of firewood, twice what she would burn in a single winter. The excess was intentional. She wanted reserves, margins, insurance against the unexpected. She wanted to never again face the possibility of running out of burnable wood. The 2 structures flanking her cabin created a strange symmetry, making her homestead look fortified, as if she had built defensive positions rather than simple storage. In early September, she began the 3rd structure. This one went up east of her cabin, positioned to eventually form part of a perimeter. The neighbors' whispers intensified. Ingrid Hoffman had lost her mind. She was building a wall of wood sheds around her property. She had spent her entire widow's savings on lumber and nails for structures that served no rational purpose beyond her obsession. The kindest observers suggested grief had unbalanced her judgment. The less kind suggested she had always been strange, and widowhood had simply revealed her true nature. The 3rd shed was completed by October, filled with another 4 cords of meticulously stacked firewood. October brought the first serious cold snap, temperatures dropping below freezing at night, reminding the valley that winter approached. Ingrid began the 4th and final structure, this one west of her cabin, completing what had become undeniably clear to everyone. She was building a square of firewood sheds around her homestead, creating a compound where her cabin sat centered among 4 massive storage buildings. The visual effect was striking and absurd in equal measure. Her property looked like a small fort, but instead of defensive walls, she had wood sheds. Instead of strategic military planning, she had an obsession with staying warm. The mockery became open. Men gathering at the trading post in Helena made jokes about Hoffman's firewood fort. Travelers passing through the valley detoured slightly to see the widow's strange construction project. Children dared each other to approach close enough to touch the sheds, as if they were somehow dangerous or magical. The ridicule bothered Ingrid less than the concerned visits from neighbors who genuinely believed she needed intervention. They offered to help her sell the property, to arrange travel back east, to connect her with family who could provide guidance and support. Ingrid refused all assistance and continued building. The 4th shed matched the others in every detail, proving this was not random construction, but a deliberate plan executed with precision. When completed in late October, she had 4 structures forming a square around her cabin, each positioned approximately 15 feet from the main building, each filled floor to ceiling with split firewood. The total storage capacity exceeded 20 cords, enough wood to heat her cabin for 4 winters without cutting another stick. The walking paths between cabin and sheds remained clear and direct. From her door, Ingrid could reach any of the 4 structures in 10 steps through any weather. The shed's open fronts faced inward toward the cabin, creating protected access while the solid backs and sides faced outward, blocking wind from all cardinal directions. She had inadvertently created a microclimate in the center space where her cabin sat, a zone sheltered from the worst wind and drifting snow. People called it wasteful. They called it crazy. They called it Hoffman's Wall, a name that stuck and spread through the valley. The widow who built a wall of firewood around her house became a local legend, the kind of story travelers shared in taverns, exaggerated with each retelling. Some versions had her building 6 sheds, others claimed 10. Some said she planned to wall herself in completely and never speak to another human. The truth was strange enough without embellishment, but truth rarely stopped good gossip. What no one acknowledged was the engineering Ingrid had accomplished. Her 4 sheds held seasoned firewood in conditions that would keep it dry indefinitely. The wood was organized, accessible, protected from every weather condition Montana could produce. The structures themselves were built to survive decades of heavy snow, high wind, and temperature extremes. She had created infrastructure that solved the exact problem that had killed her husband, and she had done it with such thoroughness that failure was virtually impossible. November brought snow, light at first, then heavier as the month progressed. Ingrid watched her neighbors return to the same firewood storage methods that had failed them the previous winter. The Carlsons stacked their wood and covered it with new canvas. The Mullers improved their pile with a larger tarp secured more carefully. The Pattersons rebuilt their lean-to with an additional wall, creating better protection, but still leaving one side exposed. Everyone made minor adjustments, small improvements, learning just enough from the previous disaster to feel confident they had solved the problem. Ingrid said nothing. She had learned that people resented unsolicited advice, especially from someone they considered unbalanced. She tended her own preparation, checking her sheds regularly, ensuring the structures remained sound as snow accumulated on their roofs. The buildings performed exactly as designed. Snow shed cleanly from the steep, pitched roofs. No moisture penetrated to the stacked wood inside. The open fronts allowed air circulation, while the overhead protection kept everything dry. December arrived with typical Montana severity. Temperatures dropped and stayed low, hovering near zero during the day, plunging well below at night. Snow fell steadily, accumulating in feet rather than inches. Ingrid burned wood from her nearest shed, walking the 10 steps from her door, selecting pieces from the accessible stacks, returning to warmth within moments. Her fires burned hot and clean, the dry wood igniting immediately and producing maximum heat with minimal smoke. She developed a routine. Each morning she carried enough wood inside to last the day, stacking it near the fireplace where radiant heat would dry it even further. She never rushed, never struggled through deep snow to reach buried piles, never fought with frozen logs or ice-coated bark. The system she had built eliminated every difficulty that made winter firewood management miserable. What had been a daily battle for survival became a simple, easy task. By late December, differences between homesteads became visible to anyone paying attention. Smoke from Ingrid's chimney rose steady and strong, dark columns indicating hot fires burning efficiently. Smoke from neighboring cabins was lighter, whiter, the signature of wet wood struggling to burn. Ingrid's paths between cabin and sheds remained clear, trampled down by regular use. Her neighbors' paths to their woodpiles grew deeper with each snowfall, requiring constant shoveling to maintain access. January 1863 began with a blizzard that buried the valley under 3 feet of snow in 2 days. Wind drove the snow into drifts that reached second-story windows on buildings that had second stories. Temperatures during the key. Storm dropped to 20 below zero, and after the storm passed, they continued falling. The cold became dangerous. The kind of extreme that killed livestock and threatened humans foolish enough to spend time outside. The blizzard ended on January 4th, leaving behind a landscape transformed into something alien and hostile. Snow covered everything to uniform depth, erasing familiar landmarks, turning the valley into a white expanse broken only by cabin roofs and chimney tops. The temperature on January 5th dropped to 37 below zero, cold enough that exposed skin froze in minutes, cold enough that breathing outdoor air hurt lungs, cold enough that survival became the only consideration that mattered. Ingrid woke that morning to a cabin that, while cold, remained livable. Her fire had burned through the night, fed by wood she had brought inside the previous evening. She dressed in layers, wrapped herself in wool, and stepped outside to gather more fuel. The cold struck like a hammer, but her nearest shed was 10 steps away. She walked to it, selected an armload of wood from the perfectly dry stack, and returned to her cabin within 2 minutes. The wood ignited immediately when placed on her coals, and within 20 minutes her cabin was warm again. 2 miles east, the Carlson family was dying. Their woodpile, covered with canvas that had held through the blizzard, was nonetheless buried under 4 feet of snow. The canvas had created a pocket where the wood remained relatively protected, but reaching it required digging through snow that had drifted and compacted into something approaching ice. Thomas Carlson spent 40 minutes excavating enough snow to reach his wood, and when he finally pulled logs free, he found them coated in frost and ice from his own breath condensing in the extreme cold. The wood would not burn. He tried for an hour, using precious kindling, watching his family grow colder as the cabin's residual heat dissipated into the brutal air outside. His wife Martha wrapped their 3 children in every blanket they owned, huddling them together for shared warmth, knowing that this was how people died in winter. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but through gradual failure of the systems that sustained life. At the Muller homestead, Carl Muller was discovering that his improved tarp system had failed differently, but just as completely. The tarp had held, but moisture from the ground had wicked upward through his stacked wood, freezing solid when the temperature dropped. His logs were locked together in a mass of ice, impossible to separate without tools he could not use in this cold. He managed to break free several pieces, but they were too wet to burn, and his fire died, surrounded by useless fuel. The Patterson family fared slightly better. Their 3-sided shed provided some protection, and they could access wood without digging through deep snow. But the wood itself had absorbed moisture during the preceding weeks of lighter snow and occasional thaw cycles. It burned poorly, creating more smoke than heat, and they were slowly poisoning themselves with carbon monoxide in their desperate attempt to stay warm with inadequate ventilation. By midday on January 5th, 6 families in the valley were in crisis. Fires dead or dying, wood supplies inadequate or inaccessible, temperatures inside cabins dropping toward fatal levels. Children stopped crying as hypothermia progressed. Adults made increasingly poor decisions as cold affected their thinking. The valley was experiencing exactly what had happened the previous winter, but worse because this cold was more extreme and the snow was deeper. Thomas Carlson made his decision at 2 in the afternoon on January 5th. His youngest child, the 4-year-old boy who had nearly died the previous winter, was showing signs of severe hypothermia. The child had stopped shivering, his skin was pale and waxy, and he responded slowly when spoken to. Martha held him close, trying to share body heat that she barely possessed herself. And Thomas understood that without fire, without warmth, his son would die within hours. He needed help, and the only person in the valley who seemed prepared for this level of winter severity was the widow everyone had mocked. The walk from the Carlson cabin to Ingrid's homestead normally took 30 minutes. In 4 feet of snow with temperatures at 37 below zero, it took Thomas nearly 2 hours. He followed familiar landmarks when he could see them, guessed at direction when he could not, and pushed forward with the desperation of a father watching his child die. His face froze despite the scarf wrapped around it. His fingers went numb inside heavy gloves. When he finally saw Ingrid's homestead, he almost wept with relief. Smoke poured from her chimney in a thick black column that meant a roaring fire burning perfectly dry wood. Her shed stood exactly as they had all autumn, solid and strange, surrounding her cabin like guardian structures. Thomas stumbled forward and reached her door more dead than alive. Ingrid opened at his knock and pulled him inside without questions. The warmth of her cabin was overwhelming, painful against his frozen skin. She sat him near her fire, brought him coffee that burned his throat going down, and waited for him to recover enough to speak. When he could finally form words, they came out broken and desperate. His family was freezing, his fire was dead, his wood would not burn, his son was dying. Ingrid did not hesitate. She moved to her storage corner and began loading a sled she kept for exactly this purpose. She filled it with split firewood from the stack she maintained inside her cabin, wood that was not just dry, but had been kept in heated air for days, wood that would ignite from a single match. She added kindling, some of her precious fire-starting materials, and several wool blankets. Then she dressed for the extreme cold and told Thomas they were leaving immediately. The return journey was harder than Thomas's desperate walk to find help. Pulling a loaded sled through deep snow required strength that Thomas had mostly exhausted. Ingrid took the lead, breaking trail, her smaller frame working with efficiency, born from months of solitary labor. They moved slowly but steadily, following the trench Thomas had created on his way to her cabin. They reached the Carlson cabin as the sun set. Inside, they found Martha huddled with all 3 children under a pile of blankets, the cabin barely warmer than the air outside. Ingrid went immediately to work. She cleared the dead fire, arranged kindling with practiced hands, and built a structure designed to catch and spread flame efficiently. The fire Ingrid built in the Carlson fireplace caught on the first match and spread through the kindling with eager hunger. Within 5 minutes, flames consumed the dry wood she had brought, creating heat that pushed back against the deadly cold. Within 15 minutes, the cabin's interior temperature had risen enough that the children stopped their ominous stillness and began shivering again, a sign their bodies were recovering. Within 30 minutes, Martha was crying with relief, holding her youngest son who had color returning to his face. Ingrid stayed long enough to ensure the fire was stable, and the family understood how to maintain it. She showed Thomas how to arrange the wood for maximum heat output, how to control airflow for efficient burning, and how much fuel to add at what intervals. She left them half of the wood she had brought, keeping the other half on her sled for what she suspected would be other families in similar crisis. Her suspicion proved correct. As she traveled back toward her homestead in the bitter twilight, she saw that the Muller cabin showed no chimney smoke. She altered her course and found Carl Muller and his wife in desperate condition, their fire dead, their cabin approaching outside temperature. She repeated her rescue, building them a fire from her dry wood, leaving them enough fuel to survive the night. She continued on to the Patterson homestead and found them struggling with a smoking fire that provided more carbon monoxide than warmth. She helped them rebuild their fire properly, demonstrated ventilation techniques they had not understood, and left them wood that would burn cleanly. By the time she returned to her own cabin, the moon had risen, and the temperature had dropped to 42 below zero. She was exhausted, frozen, and nearly out of the emergency wood she had brought. But 6 people were alive who would have died without her intervention. Word of what Ingrid had done spread through the valley with the sunrise. The widow everyone had mocked, the woman they had called crazy for her excessive preparation, had saved 3 families from freezing to death. More significantly, she had done it because she possessed what no one else had, an abundance of perfectly dry, immediately accessible firewood stored in conditions that made it invulnerable to weather. Over the following days, as the extreme cold persisted, neighbors began visiting Ingrid's homestead to see her structures with new eyes. They examined the construction, asked questions about her building methods, and calculated how much wood her 4 sheds could hold. What they saw was not the obsessive project of a grief-stricken widow, but rather the engineering solution to a problem that had proven fatal. The questions came carefully at first, then with increasing directness. How deep were her post holes? What pitch had she used for the roofs? How did she prevent the stacked wood from shifting? Ingrid answered every question with the same patient detail, sharing her knowledge freely. understanding that this was how survival techniques spread on the frontier. Spring arrived in April 1863 with the usual Montana mud and melting snow. As the valley thawed, evidence of the brutal winter became visible in ways that statistics could not capture. 3 families had left, unable or unwilling to face another season in country that had nearly killed them. 2 cabins stood empty, their occupants having packed what they could carry and headed for Oregon or California. The survivors who remained looked at the coming year with a mixture of determination and dread. But something else became visible that spring. Construction. Nearly every homestead in the valley showed signs of building projects, and the structures taking shape were unmistakable. Firewood sheds, not simple lean-tos or covered piles, but permanent buildings designed specifically for protecting wood from weather. The valley that had mocked Ingrid Hoffman for her excessive preparation was now copying her methods with the fervor of the converted. Thomas Carlson started his shed in late April, positioning it south of his cabin exactly as Ingrid had done. He used her post, depth measurements, her rafter spacing, her roof pitch. He built with care that would have seemed obsessive before the previous winter, but now seemed merely prudent. His shed was smaller than Ingrid's, sized for his family's needs rather than her abundance, but the engineering principles were identical. Carl Muller built 2 sheds, placing them east and west of his cabin. He lacked Ingrid's carpentry skill, and his structures showed it in their rougher finish and less precise joinery. But they were solid, they were functional, and they would keep his firewood dry. That was sufficient. Perfection mattered less than protection. The Patterson family went further. They built 3 sheds arranged in a U shape around their cabin, creating wind protection and massive storage capacity. Others in the valley watched this construction and nodded approval rather than offering mockery. The Pattersons had nearly died from carbon monoxide poisoning. If they wanted to ensure abundant dry fuel for clean-burning fires, that was wisdom, not excess. By June, 11 homesteads in the valley had firewood sheds in various stages of completion. The structures varied in size, quality, and exact design, but they shared common elements: permanent posts set deep in the ground, solid roofs pitched for snow shedding, open fronts for air circulation and access, protection from weather while allowing the wood to continue seasoning. Every builder had visited Ingrid's homestead, studied her structures, asked questions, and adapted her techniques to their own circumstances and capabilities. Ingrid watched this transformation with quiet satisfaction. She had not built her sheds to start a movement or prove a point. She had built them to survive. But survival techniques that worked spread naturally, adopted by people who recognized value when they saw it demonstrated. Her valley was becoming safer, better prepared, more resilient against the winter that would inevitably return. The knowledge she had gained through tragedy and obsessive focus was now community property, shared freely and implemented widely. The summer of 1863 was busy with wood cutting throughout the valley. Men who had previously treated firewood preparation as a late autumn task now started in June, understanding that proper seasoning required time. They felled trees, cut them to length, split the rounds, and began stacking in their new sheds with attention to detail that would have seemed absurd 2 years earlier. The valley rang with the sound of axes and splitting mauls from dawn until dusk. Ingrid continued her own preparations, though her abundance meant she was cutting wood for future years rather than immediate need. She had developed a rotation system, cut and stack new wood in sheds that held seasoned wood from previous years. Burn the oldest, driest wood first. Maintain at least 2 years of supply at all times. Never depend on wood cut the same year it would be burned. The system required planning and discipline, but it guaranteed she would never face wet wood again. Neighbors began consulting her about aspects of firewood management beyond just shed construction. How should wood be split for optimal drying? What species of trees made the best firewood? How tight should stacking be to balance airflow against stability? Ingrid answered, based on her experience, sharing observations she had made through careful attention to how different approaches produced different results. Pine burned hot but fast, she explained, ideal for quick heat but requiring constant feeding. Aspen was readily available but produced less heat per piece. Cottonwood was abundant near creeks but heavy and difficult to split. The best firewood came from dead standing trees, already partially seasoned, but living trees cut in late winter dried faster than those cut in spring, when sap was rising. Every detail mattered. Every choice affected the final result. The valley developed informal standards. A family needed approximately 4 to 6 cords per winter, depending on cabin size and insulation quality. Wood should be split to pieces no more than 6 inches in diameter for efficient drying and burning. Sheds should hold at least 1.5 times the expected winter consumption to provide margin for severe weather or unexpected circumstances. These standards emerged from collective experience, distilled from individual failures and successes, and Ingrid's methods formed their foundation. By August, the valley's total firewood storage capacity had increased dramatically. Where previously families had stored perhaps one winter's supply in questionable conditions, they now maintained multiple years of wood in permanent protected structures. The investment in construction and labor was substantial, but it was investment in survival infrastructure, and people who had nearly frozen understood the value proposition clearly. The transformation extended beyond simple preparation. Families helped each other with construction and wood cutting, sharing labor and knowledge. The crisis of the previous winter had created bonds between neighbors who had previously maintained polite but distant relationships. Survival often does this, turning individuals into communities through shared recognition of mutual vulnerability. Winter 1863 arrived early with snow in October and temperatures that dropped steadily through November. By December, the valley was locked in conditions similar to the previous year, though not quite as severe. Snow accumulated in feet. Temperature stayed below zero for weeks. Wind created drifts that buried anything not elevated or protected. It was a hard winter by any measure, the kind that tested preparation and revealed weaknesses in planning. But this winter was different. Smoke rose from every chimney in steady dark columns that indicated hot fires burning dry wood. No desperate visits between homesteads seeking help. No families huddled in freezing cabins around dead fires. The valley had learned its lesson, implemented solutions, and was now experiencing the benefits of proper preparation. What had been crisis the previous year was now merely inconvenience. Ingrid maintained her routine, walking the few steps from her cabin to whichever shed was most convenient, selecting wood, returning to warmth. Her fires burned perfectly, her cabin stayed warm, and her abundant reserves meant she never worried about running short. The system she had built worked exactly as designed, and the winter that would have terrified her 2 years earlier was now simply weather to be endured. She occasionally saw neighbors during breaks in the storms, people venturing out to check livestock or retrieve supplies. They waved, exchanged brief greetings, and returned to their own warm cabins. The casual normalcy of these interactions represented a profound change. Winter was no longer a life-threatening emergency, requiring constant crisis management. It was a season difficult but manageable, endured through preparation rather than luck. In February, a storm arrived that matched the severity of the previous year's crisis. 4 feet of snow in 3 days, temperatures dropping to 35 below zero, wind that created drifts reaching second-story windows. It was the kind of storm that killed people, the kind that tested every aspect of frontier survival. The valley hunkered down and waited for it to pass. When the storm ended, Ingrid ventured outside to check her sheds and found them exactly as they had been. Snow had shed from the pitched roofs. The structures stood solid and undamaged. The firewood inside remained perfectly dry and accessible. She gathered an armload, returned to her cabin, and built up her fire. Then she looked around her valley and saw smoke rising from every chimney, proof that her neighbors had survived equally well. No one died that winter. No one nearly froze. No one faced the terror of watching their children grow cold while wet wood refused to burn. The valley's collective preparation, born from tragedy and educated by Ingrid's example, had transformed winter from a deadly threat into a manageable hardship. The difference was infrastructure, knowledge, and the willingness to invest effort into preventing crisis rather than merely responding to it. By 1865, Ingrid's firewood shed design had spread beyond her immediate valley. Travelers passing through saw the structures, asked questions, and carried the knowledge to other settlements. Traders mentioned the technique at distant outposts. New settlers arriving in Montana heard about proper firewood storage before they even built their first cabins. What had begun as one widow's obsessive response to personal tragedy had become standard practice across a broad region. The design evolved as it spread. Some builders added partial fourth walls for additional wind protection. Others incorporated storage for tools or kindling into the shed structures. A few creative individuals built sheds with adjustable roofs that could be raised or lowered depending on how full the wood storage was. But the core principles remained constant: permanent construction, weather protection, air circulation, and accessibility. These elements defined proper firewood storage, and they traced directly back to Ingrid's original structures. Ingrid herself had become something of an authority on frontier survival preparation. People wrote her letters asking for advice on various aspects of homestead infrastructure. A traveling journalist stopped at her homestead in the summer of 1865 and wrote an article about her for a San Francisco newspaper. The article focused on her sheds, her methods, and the lives her preparation had saved. It portrayed her as an example of frontier ingenuity and practical wisdom. She found the attention uncomfortable. She had not built her sheds to gain recognition or establish authority. She had built them to survive, to never again experience the helplessness of watching someone die from preventable causes. The fact that her solution had helped others was satisfying, but she had no interest in becoming a public figure or frontier celebrity. She answered letters when they arrived, shared information freely, and otherwise maintained her quiet existence. The valley itself had prospered in ways that extended beyond firewood preparation. The collaborative spirit that had emerged during the crisis winters persisted into peacetime. Families helped each other with construction projects, harvest work, and child rearing. The community had discovered that mutual support was not just morally good, but practically valuable. Isolated homesteaders were vulnerable. Connected neighbors were resilient. Ingrid participated in this community while maintaining her independent streak. She attended gatherings, helped when asked, and accepted help when offered. But she also preserved her solitude, her self-sufficiency, her unwillingness to depend on others for essential survival needs. The balance suited her personality and her circumstances. She was part of the community, but not defined by it. In 1866, she added a fifth shed to her property, this one designed specifically for storing seasoning wood. The structure was oriented differently from the others, positioned to maximize sun exposure and wind flow. The wood stored there would season for 2 full years before being moved to her primary storage sheds for burning. The addition represented her continuing refinement of the system, her ongoing attention to optimization and improvement. Neighbors no longer found her building projects strange or excessive. They recognized her as someone who thought deeply about practical problems and implemented thorough solutions. Her fifth shed was noted, admired, and within a year, 3 other families had built similar seasoning structures. The years between 1867 and 1872 passed with the rhythmic predictability that characterized successful frontier life. Summers meant cutting wood, tending gardens, making repairs, and preparing for winter. Winters meant staying warm, maintaining equipment, and enduring cold until spring returned. The cycles repeated, and within those cycles, Ingrid found contentment, if not happiness. Her sheds required minimal maintenance. The roofs occasionally needed repairs where wind had lifted shakes or snow weight had stressed rafters. The posts showed no signs of rot, their deep setting and quality construction ensuring longevity. Every few years, she applied additional tar paper to vulnerable areas, preventing water infiltration before it could cause damage. The structures she had built in grief and obsession were proving their worth through simple durability. The valley continued growing slowly. New families arrived, drawn by reports of good land and established community. Each new homestead built firewood sheds as a matter of course, usually before completing their main cabins. The priority had shifted. Shelter was important, but fuel storage was essential. This represented a fundamental change in frontier thinking, a recognition that infrastructure supporting survival deserved equal attention to living space itself. Ingrid watched young families arrive and establish themselves using principles she had pioneered. They built their sheds, cut their wood, and prepared for winter with systematic thoroughness that would have seemed paranoid a decade earlier. But it was not paranoia. It was wisdom born from community memory of the winter when people nearly died, when inadequate preparation led to crisis, when one woman's excessive caution proved to be exactly sufficient. She aged gracefully through these years, her body hardening from constant physical labor, her hands becoming permanently calloused, her face weathering into the leather complexion of someone who spent most of their time outdoors. She was in her mid-40s by 1872, considered old for a frontier woman, though she remained strong and capable. She could still cut and split wood with efficiency that shamed men half her age. The valley knew her story, though they rarely discussed it in her presence. New arrivals heard about Lars Hoffman's death, about the terrible winter of 1862, about Ingrid's response and how it had changed the entire community's approach to winter preparation. The story was told around fires, passed from family to family, becoming part of the valley's foundational narrative. Every firewood shed was a monument to that story, a physical reminder of lessons learned through tragedy. Ingrid had no children, no family beyond distant relatives back east, with whom she maintained occasional correspondence. Her legacy would not be genetic, but architectural, not descendants, but structures, not family, trees, but building techniques that would outlive her by generations. She understood this and accepted it. Some people left children. She would leave knowledge and the physical evidence of that knowledge built into permanent infrastructure across a region. By 1875, variations of Ingrid's firewood shed design had spread throughout Montana Territory and into parts of Wyoming and Idaho. The structures appeared in mining camps, military forts, trading posts, and homesteads. Each location adapted the basic principles to local conditions and available materials, but the engineering remained recognizable. Permanent posts, pitched roofs, open fronts, weather protection. The DNA of Ingrid's original design persisted across hundreds of miles and thousands of individual implementations. A lieutenant at Fort Benton submitted a report to the Army Corps of Engineers recommending that all frontier military installations adopt covered firewood storage as standard infrastructure. His report cited reduced fuel consumption, improved heating efficiency, and elimination of weather-related heating failures. The Army, characteristically slow to adopt civilian innovations, nonetheless recognized practical value when documented with proper military precision. Within 3 years, permanent firewood storage became standard at Western forts. The technique also spread into commercial applications. Logging camps built enormous versions of Ingrid's sheds to store firewood for steam-powered equipment. Railroad maintenance stations constructed covered wood storage for locomotives that still burned wood rather than coal. Hotels and boarding houses in frontier towns built sheds to ensure they could maintain heat for paying customers regardless of weather. What had started as personal survival infrastructure became recognized as essential commercial infrastructure. Ingrid learned about this spread through letters and occasional newspaper articles that people sent her. She read them, with mild interest but little emotional investment. The fact that her design had proven valuable across diverse applications was satisfying in an abstract way, but it did not change her daily life or her fundamental understanding of why she had built what she built. She had solved a specific problem for personal reasons. That others found her solution useful was natural consequence, not intended purpose. In 1876, a carpenter from Helena visited her homestead with a specific request. He wanted to document her original structures in detailed drawings that could be used as construction guides for people building their own sheds. He spent 3 days measuring, sketching, and asking questions about her building techniques. Ingrid cooperated, though she found the attention somewhat bewildering. To her, the sheds were simply functional structures, no more remarkable than a well-built barn or root cellar. The carpenter's drawings were published in a Montana territory. Agricultural Bulletin in 1877. The publication included detailed measurements, material lists, step-by-step construction instructions, and explanations of the engineering principles that made the design effective. The bulletin was distributed to homesteaders, government agents, and anyone else who requested agricultural information. It became one of the most requested documents in the bulletin's history. Ingrid received a copy of the bulletin and was surprised to see her sheds rendered in precise, technical drawings with annotations explaining features she had developed through intuition and trial rather than formal engineering knowledge. Seeing her work translated into official documentation gave her a strange feeling, as if something personal had become public property. Ingrid Hoffman died on January 23, 1881, 19 years to the day after Lars had died in the cold cabin that had started everything. She was 52 years old. The cause was pneumonia, contracted during a January cold snap that was severe but not extraordinary by Montana standards. Her shed stood full of dry firewood. Her cabin was warm, but illness does not respect preparation, and her body, worn from 2 decades of hard frontier living, could not fight the infection. She died alone in her cabin, which would have bothered some people, but would not have bothered her. She had lived alone for 19 years, preferring solitude to the complications of remarriage or dependence on others. Her neighbors found her 2 days after her death, when smoke stopped rising from her chimney, and no one saw her moving between cabin and sheds. Thomas Carlson, whose son she had saved in 1863, was the one who entered her cabin and found her body. The valley buried her on a hillside overlooking her homestead. Nearly every family in the valley attended, along with people from neighboring valleys who had known her or known of her. The service was simple, conducted by a traveling preacher who had never met Ingrid, but who had heard stories about her sheds and her survival methods. He spoke about practical virtue, about the godliness of preparation, about helping neighbors through example rather than preaching. After the funeral, discussion turned to what should be done with her property. She had left no will, no heirs, no specific instructions. The homestead reverted to territorial jurisdiction, which meant it would eventually be sold or granted to new settlers. But before any official transfer occurred, the valley made a collective decision. Ingrid's 4 original sheds, the structures that had started the transformation of frontier firewood storage, should be preserved as landmarks. The idea met with universal approval. The sheds were maintained by rotating volunteer labor, their roofs repaired, their structural integrity preserved. They stood empty of firewood, monuments rather than functional storage, but they endured. Travelers passing through the valley were shown the sheds and told the story of the widow who had built them, who had saved lives through preparation, whose engineering had spread across the entire region. The preservation lasted 15 years. In 1896, A new family acquired the property and needed the sheds for their original purpose. They filled them with firewood, ending the brief period of monument status, but returning the structures to functional use. This seemed appropriate. Ingrid had not built monuments. She had built tools for survival. Using them honored her memory more than preserving them as curiosities. By 1900, most of the people who had known Ingrid personally were dead. The valley's collective memory of the terrible winter of 1862 had faded into historical anecdote, but the sheds remained, both her original structures and the hundreds of descendants built using her principles. The physical legacy persisted even as personal memory faded. The story of Ingrid Hoffman and her firewood sheds illustrates fundamental principles about innovation on the American frontier that extend far beyond one widow's response to personal tragedy. First, meaningful innovation often emerges from necessity rather than theoretical exercise. Ingrid did not set out to revolutionize firewood storage. She set out to never again watch someone die from preventable causes. The innovation was a byproduct of that focused determination. Second, good solutions spread organically when they address real problems. Ingrid never marketed her design, never promoted it beyond answering questions from curious neighbors. The technique spread because it worked, because people who saw it recognized value, and because frontier communities shared survival knowledge as a matter of practical necessity. The spread was viral before that term existed, driven by demonstrated effectiveness rather than advertising. Third, frontier innovation combined traditional knowledge with creative adaptation. Ingrid used basic carpentry and construction principles that had existed for centuries. What made her approach innovative was not the invention of new techniques, but the application of existing techniques to a specific problem with unusual thoroughness. She took building methods designed for cabins and barns and adapted them specifically for firewood storage, creating purpose-built infrastructure where others had used makeshift solutions. The technical specifications of what Ingrid accomplished reveal the magnitude of improvement her methods represented. Standard frontier firewood storage of the 1860s involved open stacking, perhaps covered with canvas or bark, requiring minimal time or investment but providing unreliable weather protection. Wood stored this way often became wet, frozen, or inaccessible during severe weather. Fires built from wet wood burned inefficiently, created excessive smoke, and sometimes failed to burn at all. Ingrid's covered shed system required significant upfront investment in time, materials, and labor. A single shed took approximately 2 weeks to build with one person working. Materials cost approximately $15 to $20 in 1860 period prices, equivalent to several $100s today. But the return on that investment was permanent infrastructure that protected firewood indefinitely, guaranteed dry fuel regardless of weather, and eliminated the daily struggle of accessing usable wood during winter storms. The physics behind her success centered on moisture management and accessibility. Wood burns efficiently only when moisture content drops below 20%. Freshly cut wood contains 50 to 60% moisture and requires months of seasoning to become burnable. Wood exposed to rain, snow, or ground moisture reabsorbs water even if initially dry. Ingrid's sheds prevented moisture exposure while allowing air circulation that continued the seasoning process. The result was wood that remained at optimal burning moisture year-round. Modern descendants of Ingrid's design remain visible throughout the northern Rockies. Contemporary homesteaders build covered firewood storage as standard practice, often using metal roofing and modern materials but following the same basic principles. Permanent structure, weather protection, air circulation, convenient access. The engineering she pioneered through grief and obsession has become codified wisdom, taught and implemented without most practitioners knowing its origin. The impossible had become routine through simple recognition that protecting your fuel supply deserve the same care as protecting your shelter.